Hey everyone, we're going to be starting here in about a minute. I'm just kind of understanding behavior, the three-term contingency. We'll try to keep our questions either in the chat or at the end. We can ask some questions and go over some things if you guys have some questions. So hang on, I think everyone's kind of filtering in here. This presentation is just called Understand Behavior, the three-term contingency. And my name is Chris Allen. I'm a behavior analyst here at CA Human Services. So with this course, the purpose of this course is to provide an introduction to behavioral support. And this is going to kind of introduce how behavior analysts, and not just behavior analysts, see behavior, because a lot of people use this three-term contingency. So this will help us kind of visualize and kind of see behavior. And this is also going to aid us in understanding how all behavior works, not just problem behavior or maladaptive behavior, those interfering behaviors we see. We want to be able to kind of get a whole understanding of what behavior is and why we engage in behavior and kind of how that behavior works. So those are kind of the purposes of this course. And so kind of by the end of the course, the idea is you will understand kind of the basis of applied behavioral analysis. So this three-term contingency is is the building block of what we use in kind of our field, as well as a lot of other fields. And so you'll be able to use this knowledge to improve and kind of extend interventions for individuals with those maladaptive behaviors or those interfering behaviors or those socially inappropriate behaviors. So this course is going to provide a basis for knowledge of behavior for comprehension of treatment plans or IEPs or other documents you might see, as well as just kind of understanding behavioral comprehension as well. And it establishes those communications, the communication with other people on those principles, whether it's applied behavior analysis or you're working with teachers in a school or mental health professionals. This course will kind of help understand that basis of communication and give some kind of level of ways to talk to people when we're looking at behavior. So kind of what we're looking at here is introduction. And if you stick with me as we go, Thursday we'll build on this, and then next week we'll build on these presentations as well. But here is kind of the principles of behavior. So almost all behavior is learned. From a very, very, very young age, we learn behavior. And so all behavior occurs for a reason. We might not always know the reason, and there may be multiple reasons for it, but all behavior has a reason for it. And no behaviors really occur out of the blue. There is a reason why they're engaging that behavior, even if we don't know or they don't know it. We're under the understanding that all behavior occurs for a reason, and they continue to occur because they are effective. And when they stop becoming effective or when they're ineffective, that's when behaviors stop. So we're under the understanding that we see behaviors because they occur, because they're effective. And if we're no longer seeing that behavior, it's because it's no longer effective. And that's it's a little simplified because in actual practicality, it's a little bit harder to determine what's effective and what's ineffective. But that's kind of the principles of behavior. It's learned, it occurs for a reason, they don't occur out of the blue, they occur because they're effective, and they stop occurring because they are ineffective. And so what we're really going to look at is what's called the ABC model of behavior. And this is kind of that foundational building block of almost all behavioral fields. And we look at it through the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. The antecedent is what comes before that behavior. That behavior is that directly observable thing that we can see. And the consequence is that reason for the behavior. And we're going to get into all three of them a little bit more in depth. So first, we're going to start with the antecedent, or what comes before the behavior. So we're going to take a little example. And so we have an antecedent. So we see a coworker when you arrive at work. They're kind of that trigger. Our behavior is we say hello. And the consequence we get back is that coworker saying hello back to us. That's a pretty clear example of the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Kind of how we see a behavior is that behavior didn't occur in a vacuum. Our behavior of saying hello had a signal or something that triggered it, that antecedent, and it had a consequence or a reason why we say hello, is because we get that hello back. And so these antecedents is what is a stimulus that precedes a behavior that makes it more likely that a behavior will occur. So when we're looking at antecedents, we're kind of looking at a couple of things. We're looking at when and where the behavior occurred, what happened before the behavior occurred, and kind of who was present when the behavior occurred. The antecedent isn't always as easy to identify as that last example. Sometimes it's kind of tricky and can take a lot of practice and a lot of just observation to kind of actually see what that antecedent is. And so when we're looking at antecedents, we want to make sure we're kind of identifying what that antecedent is. So let's say a student walks into English class and the teacher says, sit down and start your journal. The student asks to go to the bathroom and the teacher says, quickly. I was a teacher for a while. This is a very, very common interaction with a student. So what is the three-term contingency for the student in this situation? Well, our antecedent, they were instructed to sit down and start your journal. So they were given a directive. Their behavior was asking to go to the bathroom. So can I go to the bathroom? And then the consequence of that behavior in this situation was they had to walk out of the classroom. So that's our three-term contingency kind of when we're looking at a school. We had the teacher give an instruction or give a signal of what they're supposed to do, was sit down and start their journal. They had the student engage in a behavior of asking to go to the bathroom. And that behavior was rewarded with the consequence of walking out of the classroom. Now, what they did out of the classroom, whether they went to the bathroom or not, that's up to determine, but we observed the teacher said, yep, you can go, and they left the classroom. So when we're looking at antecedents, we really want to look at a couple things. Biological factors are an antecedent, and they can be fatigue, pain, discomfort. A lot of people carry a medical history, so medical problems can be a big antecedent. And then for anyone who's on medication or has had taken medication in the past, those medication side effects can be huge kind of triggers for behavior, as well as changes in eating, sleeping. There's a lot of other biological factors that go into how our behavior works. And biological factors can be a little more tricky to determine because a lot of times they kind of need a medical professional to determine those antecedents. We can also have environmental factors. So a lot of what's going on around us affects our behavior. And we don't always know what environmental factors are affecting our behavior. So a loud, crowded environment can affect our behavior, whether we know it or not. Space arrangement, how close we are to people. Are we sitting next to someone that we like? All these things, what the actual room is kind of laid out. Any routines that they have, so morning and evening grooming schedules, whether we get up and brush our teeth and take a shower in the morning, some people shower in the evening, things like that. All those grooming schedules and how we kind of live our life determines a lot of our behavior. Evening activities or day activities, if we worked out a lot, if we've been active, all of those things. Meals, schedules for chores or work if we have a job, or if we're a kid and have chores or jobs, those all affect our behavior. And then human factors, which all of these antecedents are determined by the individual. And so some people like attention more than others. So sometimes they'll be searching out for attention from peers. If they're old enough, maybe they're on social media. Social media can drive a lot of behaviors nowadays. Attention from peers, whether they're seeking for attention or seeking to avoid attention. Families, every family has a different family makeup and a different family situation, so changes in that can have drastic effects on behavior. Visitation schedules, whether we're visiting grandma or we're part of a divorced family that now has a visitation with mom and dad, all of those affect our behavior. And then staff, who they're working with. Do they have a new teacher? Do they have a new therapist? Do they switch throughout the day? All of these affect how those behaviors change and work throughout the day. So when we're looking at those antecedents, we want to make sure we're mindful of all of those kind of different things when we're trying to paint a picture. And we can't really paint a picture until we know the behavior that we're looking at. So we want to make sure we understand what the behavior is that we're looking at, so that way we can identify all of these things that happened before and kind of figure out which ones are affecting that behavior. And so when we're looking at behavior, we want to understand what behavior is. And behavior is everything a person does. This behavior refers to all behaviors, not just problem behaviors. And these behaviors serve a function. There are only 4 functions of behavior, and we're going to talk more about the 4 functions of behavior and how they drive behavior on Thursday if people want to join then as well. So these behaviors are things that can be observed, and that's critical. We want to make sure we can observe these behaviors and see them. And there's a common expression in our field called the dead man's test. If a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So lying on the floor, if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So we want to talk about, did they drop to the floor? Did they get up? So we want to look at that behavior in that observable sense. And how do we do that? It's a little bit tricky. So first, I just want to touch on those 4 functions of behavior that we're just going to identify really quickly, so that way we can talk about them a little bit and then go into the next presentation. So when we're looking at behavior, these behaviors occur to get one of these 4 things. So behaviors occur to try to escape or remove an aversive or something they really don't like, whether it's an annoying person talking to them, they get up and leave the room, things like that. We want to escape a situation we don't like. Tangibles, we want to physically access an item, an iPad, a toy, things like that. Attention, we want to access attention or interaction with another human being. So we want to gain that attention. And then sensory, physical sensations. People do things because they feel good. Some people go running because they feel good. Some people like massages. All of these things are physical sensory things that people enjoy. And so all human behavior is governed by a combination of these 4 functions, which we're going to really get into a lot more detail the next one. And so when we're looking at behavior, we want to make sure we're looking at it where we can see it. So we want to avoid statements like Sam is angry. Well, how do we know Sam is angry? Sam hit John. Oh, okay. Will is depressed. Oh, how do we know Will is depressed? Well, he's crying. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's off by himself. So we want to look at how we know that they're feeling these things. Ryan is anxious. Ryan's pacing. He's grinding his teeth. He's clenching his fist. So how do we know that there's that anxiety there? Sue is listening. So how do we know she's listening? Well, she's looking at the speaker. She's attentive by having her notes out, things like that. We want to make sure when we're looking at behavior, we're identifying the behavior as opposed to kind of what we think is happening. And we do this by giving it what we call an operational definition, or just a definition. And so we want to make sure that that definition or that behavior we're looking at is observable. We want to be able to take it in through our senses so we can notice change. And we can do that by making it measurable. We want to make sure we can use some sort of math to measure it so we can tell if it's going up or down. And if we can make it observable and measurable, we want to make sure everyone can agree on when the behavior is happening and when it isn't. this will help us if more than one person is working on the behavior or we're all talking about it, so we know what it is and what it isn't. So kind of with behavior, when we're thinking about behavior, that take-home message is we try to rely on our eyes and our ears. We try not to rely on what we think is happening. So I always ask myself, how do I know this is happening? How do I know they're sad? How do I know they're angry? How do I know they're tired? If you can answer that how question, that kind of is what your definition can be, the start of your definition. Because we want to be able to measure that change or see when that behavior is happening versus when that behavior isn't happening. And then the last part of our ABC, before we get into kind of a more focused example, is that consequence. And I know a lot of times that consequence has kind of these negative connotations where we think consequence is bad. In our model, the consequence is just a result of that behavior. So why do we engage in those behaviors? It helps to answer that why question. And so people are likely to engage in behaviors that work. That first example, when we saw a coworker, when we arrived at work, we said hello, the coworker said hello back. In the future, we're more likely to say hello to that coworker. People are less likely to engage in behaviors that do not work. You see a coworker when you arrive at work, you say hello, the coworker didn't say hello back to you. Next time, you're less likely to say hi to that coworker. All behaviors work the same way. There's a reason why they're working. There's some sort of consequence they like that's coming out of that behavior, and it's working, or it has worked in the past. So as you go on, the less likely that behavior is to work, the less likely they are to use that behavior. And it's a little bit, it can be very difficult to determine what that consequence is, and there's a lot of other factors that go into this, and as we progress, we'll talk about more and more kind of that reason or why we engage in behaviors and how to change that behavior. But the fundamental principle is people engage in behaviors that work, and they're less likely to engage in behaviors that do not work. So here's our example again. So a student comes into class. The teacher says, sit down and pull out your journal. The student asks to go to the bathroom. The teacher says no, and the student pulls out his cell phone. So our antecedent's still the same. The teacher says, sit down and pull out your journal, or just sit down. Our behavior is still the same. So they ask to go to the bathroom. So our antecedent or behavior hasn't changed that much. But our consequence now is the student sat down and pulled out their cell phone. So did the behavior change? Not this time. But in the future, the teacher says no a lot, or you can't go to the bathroom right now, the consequence may change, may be the same, where they sit down and pull their cell phone without engaging in that behavior of asking to go to the bathroom first. Who knows? But in this situation, the behavior stayed the same, but our consequence changed, or the result of that behavior. And that result of that behavior is what sometimes people are the positive results of those behaviors or those consequences. Some people refer to as reinforcers, or kind of the reason why we engage in behavior. So if you're trying to shape behavior or get them to engage in pro-social behaviors or positive behaviors, you want to use a positive consequence. Reinforcers can be a great way to do that. And there's a number of ways you can use reinforcers. So tangibles, that food or drink, can be really solid reinforcers for a lot of people. Favorite activities, so visiting family, watching TV, dancing, listening to music, singing. A lot of these reinforcers, there's a lot of reinforcers, and each person can have very, very specific reinforcers. Attention, positive verbals, or just having a conversation, not necessarily praise or positive feedback, but just having a conversation with someone, that attention. Physical contact, some people like that, those small gestures. And then you can go right specific to social reinforcers, praising them for specific things, positive feedback. Or escape can be a powerful one. When you finish your work, you can get up from the table. You can go hang out in your room. If you ever worked with teenagers, teenagers really, really like escape. They want to get away and go do their own thing. So each person and each behavior can have a different consequence of a reinforcer. We want to make sure we're getting the idea that consequences are just kind of that result of the behavior, and less like it's a bad thing. Can be a bad thing, or it can be a good thing. It's just a result of that behavior. And so we want to make sure we remember that when we're looking at reinforcers, no single item or event is reinforcing to everyone. A specific reinforcer for one individual can be a punisher or not, or an aversive for another. I always like the example at an office setting. If you have 50 some people in your office and you get praised in front of everyone, some people really like that, and other people will kind of not like that and don't like that much attention on them. So we want to make sure when we're looking at that reinforcer, we're looking at what that individual actually likes. And that strength of an item can vary with time. Sometimes they like something, sometimes they don't. Circumstances change. Satiation, whether they've had a lot of it. If they ate a giant meal and you're trying to use food as a reinforcer, it might not be as effective. And deprivation level, have they not had it in a long time? So the only real way to tell whether something's reinforcer or they like it is to measure its effect on behavior. Most adults work for a paycheck, but most adults also probably like M&Ms. We're not going to work for M&Ms, even though we like them. So we want to make sure you can measure that effect on the behavior. Will they work for it? Will they do the behavior you want them to see for that reinforcer? And so the way to do that is to just identify them. If they're vocal, you can ask them. Or verbal, you can ask them. You can observe them in just free time. You can check records from the past, try different things. You can actively measure the effects. You can talk to people. There's lots of ways to identify potential reinforcers or things that they like and that they'll work for. And then make sure when you're setting it up, when you're saying, hey, this is your consequence. If you do this, you get this. Make sure you're clear and simple. Too many ifs and uncertainties are confusing for a lot of people. You want to make sure it's clear and concise. And then giving that lecture and adding more words to it is not always useful. And then if they are able to say something and talk about it, make sure you're validating their feelings and working with them. And then the main thing is to kind of focus on nonverbal communication. As we said before, behavior is observable. We want to make sure we're observing what they're doing as much as what they're saying. So we want to focus on that nonverbal communication. Because that nonverbal communication is going to tell us a lot of things. Attention is that basic human need for everyone, and that nobody cares feeling is not a good feeling. But everyone likes different levels of attention. They like it in different ways. So if we're going to give them attention, we want to make sure we're giving them attention for their positive behaviors. And if there's someone who likes attention, we can give them lots of attention. If they like little things go a long way, we want to make sure we're matching their level of attention to what they like. And we don't want to be giving them undue attention, which then could become an aversive or something they don't like if they're getting too much attention. So we want to be mindful and pair the attention we're giving with the individual. So the last thing we're gonna take a little practice, and we're gonna look at how we actively diagram this out. And so we're gonna kind of practice as a group. You can go with me if you want to look at a different behavior or practice in a different way. You're more than welcome to. And the more you practice just identifying these, the easier it is and the more fluid it becomes. So here's kind of our behavior description practice. So kind of what we do is in this one, we're going to think of a behavior, or if you're around someone, you can observe a behavior. And so we want to describe kind of what that behavior looks like. And for this, it's not very much room, so we can just use a very simple definition. We just want to make sure it's observable. And we're going to write down what directly comes before that behavior. So when we're observing that behavior, what in the environment came right before it. Then we're going to write down kind of the consequence or what they were getting from the behavior or what happened kind of right after the behavior. And then that desired alternative is where we're going to be going in subsequent presentations. If you want to try to take a stab at writing that down or hypothesizing that function, you can, but we'll get into those a little bit later. So let's say we had a client that did some head hitting. Mom and dad or someone at the group home or someone at school, you know, said, hey, I have a student or person who's hitting their head. So we would come in and we know the behavior, so we're looking at head hitting. So we're like, okay, so we go into the home and we're observing in the home and we're looking for when that head hitting occurs or why that head hitting occurs. So we're observing in the home and we notice that as soon as brother enters the room, head hitting occurs. So we write down so we can identify the behavior of head hitting. We saw brother enters the room right before that behavior. As soon as that behavior occurs, mom and dad ran over. So now we have our three-term contingency. We have a behavior, head hitting. We have an antecedent, brother entered the room. And we had a pretty clear consequence. As soon as that individual started hitting their head, mom and dad run over, most likely to help them, to stop them from head hitting, to provide safety, to make sure that they don't injure themselves. These are all totally appropriate methods to deal with this behavior. If we're going to go into that desired alternative, most likely what we try to do is ask for attention. Maybe brother's coming into the room and taking attention from mom and dad, so that's their way of asking for attention. So maybe our hypothesized function in this case is that attention, and they're trying to seek that from mom and dad. And then as we go in further trainings, we'll look at how to actively determine that function a little better and how to change that behavior and how to get to that desired alternative of where they're asking for attention. How to identify these alternative behaviors. So if you want to take 1 minute and kind of look through that and identify maybe there's a behavior you've seen. It doesn't have to be a maladaptive behavior. It doesn't have to be a problem behavior. It can be a fun behavior like saying hello to a coworker. And just kind of take a minute to practice that before we get to any questions. If anyone has any questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. If anyone wants to email me any questions they have on this, feel free to email me. I will be sending out the presentation slides, and potentially I have that the last one as just a worksheet. I can send out just that as a worksheet as well.
Hi, my name is Isabel. I do have a question.
Yeah.
What happened with the behavior is while like my son is not verbal, and when he's sleeping, he hit his head.
When he's sleeping?
Yeah, his eyes are closed, he's sleeping, and it can be through the night.
So that one's a little more tricky because of the fact that they're sleeping. And that one, without having identified it, you could still definitely do some data collection and look at kind of when that behavior is occurring. Is there specific times? But that one definitely is going to be a little bit more tricky because of the sleeping aspect of it. But my recommendation as always is collect some data on it And then if you have a professional, like a behavior analyst or mental health professional, or even doctor, and you have a little bit of data on it, they can make a much more informed decision on how to get those desired alternatives and how to build those support plans off it. Does anyone else have any questions? Sorry, I can't really answer too many questions without being in there, and any specific questions without actively going in there and collecting the data and observing. But I'd be happy, if you wanted to reach out, I'd be happy to look at some referrals and any help I can be.
Chris Tubbs has a question. She would like to know, do you have any reinforced surveys that are best to use?
Yeah, I have a bunch. There's a couple different ways you can do for reinforcers. You can do, if they're verbal and vocal, there's some paired choice ones where it's like kind of like a would you rather have this or would you rather have this, and you can ask some questions that way. Or you can physically give them this or this and have them actively choose. So there's a bunch out there, and I'd be happy if you reach out to me in my email, just shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to pass some reinforcer surveys along. Just shoot me an email and I will pass you on the information that I have.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Look through. Looks like you had some bathroom issues. So a lot of times, bathroom issues, there's two kind of things with bathroom issues. Sometimes it's an escape mechanism where they're having fun playing and don't want to get up and go to the bathroom because they're enjoying what they're doing. And sometimes there's a sensory thing that they don't understand when they have to go. And so they'll wait to the last minute because they don't understand when they have to go, and then not ask early enough. So with bathrooms, a lot of times checking in and having them practice sitting on the toilet or going to the bathroom when they don't necessarily have to go, or checking in with them and those kind of antecedents, like, hey, do you feel like you have to go yet? And asking them to try to identify, so they can help to learn to identify that antecedent themselves, or that feeling of I have to go, because a lot of times kids struggle to identify that feeling of when they have to go. So practicing that is really, it can be really beneficial. So kids being angry from class, that happens all the time. I was a high school and middle school teacher for a long time. And a lot of times those antecedents carry over. So you have that antecedent from the first class that's still affecting their behavior now. The hard part is they're probably not going to do much work until they can understand how to deal with those emotions. So sometimes just being empathetic and saying, hey, how can I help? I can give you 5 minutes, or I can give you 10 minutes. And trying to empathize with them, and giving them, hey, if you are, or giving them a little work, what we call some easy questions. So 3 or 4 easy questions to get the ball rolling, and then kind of ask them to do a little bit more work. Like, hey, if you do 3 or 4 questions, you can take a break. I know everyone else is working hard, but just do 3 or 4, or just put your name on the paper. Some really simple things to get the ball rolling when they're angry, or when they're not in their best work mindset, can really help. Yeah, and what it looks like, so aggressive behavior can be a very challenging behavior. And so one of the best things to do with aggressive behavior is really, really focus on the antecedent, what came right before those aggressive or those fighting behaviors, and figuring out why they're doing that, because that behavior is simply them trying to communicate something to you. And we got to figure out kind of what that aggressive behavior is communicating. Do they not want to do something? And if they don't want to do something, how can we put in a plan in place to where they can do it and it's not as hard as it was before, it's not as difficult for them. So anytime you see aggressive behavior, you really want to focus on the antecedent, kind of what's causing that behavior, and that consequence. What were they getting out of that behavior? If it was like, hey, it's time to do work, they're getting aggressive, and now all of a sudden we're dealing with the aggressive behavior, well, they're getting out of that work. And so we want to make sure we're identifying what kind of through that 3-term contingency, what the reasoning for that aggressive behavior is, so that way we can help work them through it before kind of we see that aggressive behavior. All right, so what type of reinforcement is good for transitions? Transitions is tough for a lot of our kids, and that's one of the main things we look at. And so for transitions, I really like to focus on that. A lot of times that antecedent, where are they transitioning to? Is it all transitions? Is it transitions to a non-preferred activity? Is it transitions specifically to art class? Or is it transitions specifically to the bathroom? What transition specifically? A lot of times what I do for transitions is if we're going to somewhere non-preferred, I teach them they can ask for a break. If they really don't want to go to circle time, which I have a number of clients who don't like circle time, they can ask for a break, and they don't get something fun during break, but they don't have to sit in circle time. So we can go sit somewhere else and just hang out. We don't do much, but we can just hang out. And then we go back and then they ask for break again. So we're trying to what it is they don't like for that transition. Does it make sense to remove a student with autism from the general setting into a class of students with behavior problems because he does not comply with the teacher and select students to listen to? So when we're looking at classrooms and students, we want to make sure we're putting them in that least restrictive environment. And that's going to be determination by that IEP team. And generally, you want to be able to keep kids in as much an inclusion setting as possible. However, you want to make sure you're doing it safely, and the safety of the student and others also come into play. So you really want to look at identifying what those behaviors are, why those behaviors are triggered, what that antecedent is, and what those consequences are, and really focus on identifying and building in plans for those antecedents and those consequences. Because that's going to be that key to getting them able to be in that general ed setting, is being able to identify when a behavior is likely to happen and putting a plan in place before the behavior happens. And then if the behavior happens, that we want to make sure we put a plan in place for that consequence. So if there's someone who during math class usually acts out, oh, today in math class you didn't, here's a different consequence. We want to make sure we're identifying those before and after, because that's where we really put in those plans or those in place. And that compliance with teacher and who they select to listen to, that's tricky because a lot of times that's learned history. And so if you're someone that the individual is not listening to a whole lot, my always recommendation is to give them tons of easy tasks to do and give them lots of reinforcers and praise for complying with really easy tasks, to build up that trust and build up that relationship. Because a lot of our kids is determined by relationship, especially if they're listening to some people and not others. So lots of real small, simple tasks to build that trust, and that relationship can go a long way. So it'd be from a preferred. So yeah, if that's where usually the transition issues are, is from preferred to non-preferred. And so depends on a lot of those interventions are going to depend on how many staff you have available to work with that client, the environmental stuff, what's going on in the school, the environment at the time, where do you have access to, if it's a large room, it's a small room. Because what you really want to do is if it's an activity they don't like, you either want to show them why they have to do that activity or what they're getting out of it. So what is that reinforcer on the end of the line? Or you want to have them be able to ask for escape from that, use their words and say, I don't want to do this. Okay, let's go sit over here for 2 minutes, then we'll go back to the activity. I don't want to do this. Okay, let's come back over here and sit for 2 minutes. I don't want to do this. Oh, we'll do one problem, then we can go take a break. And so you're trying to build this tolerance up, and we'll talk about that on how to build tolerance and how to shape behavior next week on some of our subsequent trainings, where we're going to really look at how to build a full support plan with antecedent interventions and consequent-based interventions in place. I think that's next Thursday, where we're really going to put all these pieces together to really look at how it all fits as a whole. So some of those presentations might be helpful and answer some of these questions on how to actively change the behavior. This one is really nice because it kind of identifies when the behavior is going to happen and why it's happening. And then we're going to look at, as we go, how to change that behavior and how, on a basic level, how to work with that behavior. Does anyone have any more questions? And if you want to reach out directly to me, I'd be happy to answer any questions via email. And just know, if you stick with us, the presentations should answer some of these questions as we go, because they should build upon each other. I didn't see any more questions. Let me know if there's a last couple questions that anyone might need. Thursday is functions of behavior. Next Tuesday is kind of behavior reduction. And then that following Thursday is replacement behavior, how to build replacement behaviors.